You think you know Henry VIII, the guy with 6 wives who founded the Church of England? Well, buckle up, because the real Henry VIII was so much worse than any history textbook dares to tell you. A king so grotesquely obese that he needed mechanical devices just to move around. His once athletic physique a distant, forgotten memory. A man whose rotting leg wounds festered for years, smelling so horrific that even his most loyal servants would literally run away gagging, clutching perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces. A ruler whose own body was falling apart so dramatically that upon his death, his coffin didn't just leak, it exploded from the gases of his violently decomposing corpse, scattering royal remains. Before we descend into this often uncomfortable truth, tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you nestled in a cozy modern home, perhaps enduring a long commute, or simply seeking a moment of quiet reflection, hidden from the general chaos of life? Drop a comment below and let me know your location and the time, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Your engagement truly helps us continue to unearth these often forgotten stories. You're about to discover the shocking, gruesome, and utterly bizarre curiosities about Henry VIII that make even the most dramatic episodes of Game of Thrones look like a children's fairy tale. From his inexplicable eating rituals, which consumed entire livestock and required a small army of chefs, to his escalating, suffocating paranoia that transformed his court into a psychological horror show. From his treatment of wives that went far beyond mere execution, delving into calculated psychological torment, to the grotesque, undignified reality of his final years, and even his death itself. These are the unsettling facts, hidden in dusty archives and often glossed over, that will irrevocably change everything you thought you knew about England's most infamous and truly monstrous king. Prepare yourselves, for the truth is far more putrid than the legends. His body was a walking disaster. Let's start with the most visceral and shocking truth about Henry VIII. By the very end of his reign, he wasn't merely ill or overweight. He was, to put it bluntly, literally a walking, breathing corpse. His body failing him in the most spectacular and repulsive ways imaginable. We're talking about a man whose once legendary athletic physique had transformed into something so grotesque, so profoundly unwell, that even his own hardened servants, accustomed to the brutal realities of court life, were visibly traumatized by his presence. Accounts from the period, whispered amongst courtiers and later penned in hesitant letters, paint a horrifying picture. Henry's waist, once trim and powerful, had ballooned to an astounding 54 inches. To truly grasp the scale of this, consider that in an era where the average man stood perhaps 5.5 feet tall, 54 inches is a measurement that exceeds the height of many individuals. He weighed an estimated 400 lebsibs, a staggering mass in an era when the average man weighed a mere 140 pounds. This was not simply a case of a king indulging in too much rich food. Something far more insidious was at play, turning his body into a massive, festering monument to his decline. But here's the truly horrifying, stomach-turning part. It wasn't just the morbid obesity that defined his final agonizing years. His legs, once strong enough for jousting and hunting, were covered in festering, weeping, open wounds that never, ever healed. These weren't just small cuts or minor sores. We are talking about massive chronic ulcers that continuously oozed pus, blood, and decaying flesh. The sheer overwhelming stench that emanated from these necrotic wounds was so potent, so utterly repulsive, that courtiers, hardened by the lack of hygiene in Tudor England, would instinctively hold perfumed handkerchiefs or even small bouquets of flowers to their faces when duty demanded they approach the king. Imagine the scene, a bustling royal court, vibrant with silks and jewels, yet pervaded by an invisible, putrid cloud. Some chilling historical accounts describe the stench as being detectable not just from across a room, but from several rooms away, infiltrating the very tapestries and furniture of the palace. The task of assisting the king with his daily dressing, which involved confronting these horrific lesions up close, was considered such a vile and dreadful duty that servants actually drew straws to determine who would be subjected to this form of literal punishment. To be in Henry's presence was to be assaulted by the putrefaction of his own living flesh. But wait, it gets even worse. Delving into the realm of modern medical conjecture that casts Henry's later tyranny in a new, chilling light, many contemporary medical experts, reviewing historical accounts and symptoms, now believe Henry suffered from a severe traumatic brain injury. This wasn't merely a bump on the head. It stemmed from a devastating jousting accident in 1536. where he was thrown from his horse and rendered unconscious for a harrowing 2 hours. In 16th century terms, to be unconscious for that long was to be practically dead, a brush with mortality from which he seemingly never fully recovered, at least mentally. This traumatic brain injury, speculate many historians and neurologists, likely caused profound and irreversible personality changes, offering a disturbing, yet perhaps partial explanation for his dramatic transformation. He devolved from the relatively charming, intellectual, and athletic young king of his early reign into the paranoid, capricious, rage-filled, and utterly merciless monster of his later years. You don't typically learn this in history classes, but beyond the brain injury, Henry also probably had a serious endocrine disorder called Cushing's syndrome. This condition, caused by prolonged exposure to high levels of cortisol, would perfectly explain his dramatic and rapid weight gain, his extreme and unpredictable mood swings, and crucially, those horrific, persistent leg ulcers that absolutely refused to heal. The irony was brutal. While Henry was obsessed with his legacy and his image, his body was in open rebellion, mirroring the chaos he inflicted on his kingdom. Adding to this medical horror, his own physicians, despite their knowledge, were so utterly terrified of his volatile temper that they wouldn't dare suggest he might be seriously ill, let alone imply that his lifestyle choices were contributing to his demise. Criticizing the king's health, or indeed any aspect of his person, was considered a direct act of treason, punishable by agonizing death. This left Henry surrounded by a sycophantic court, none daring to offer honest medical advice. And as if his physical decay wasn't enough, the man who claimed divine right to rule couldn't even control his most basic bodily functions. In his final bloated years, royal attendants had the grim duty of carrying specially designed portable chairs everywhere he went. Henry could barely make it from one room to another without the indignity of having a bowel movement accident. This is the same tyrannical guy who, just years prior, had executed people for merely looking at him the wrong way, now reduced to a pathetic, dependent state, a grotesque parody of his former power. The wives had it even worse than you think. Everyone knows Henry VIII had 6 wives, and that 2 of them met their end on the executioner's block. It's a sensationalized part of history, often reduced to a catchy rhyme, but the terrifying reality of what those women endured goes far, far beyond a simple beheading or annulment. We're talking about a level of calculated psychological torture and manipulation that would make even the most depraved modern serial killers pause. Henry didn't just discard his wives, he broke them, publicly shamed them, and often forced them into unimaginable mental anguish. Take Anne Boleyn, perhaps the most famous of his executed queens. Before her beheading, Henry didn't just make a cold decision to eliminate her. He orchestrated an elaborate, cruel, and meticulously planned frame-up, weaving a web of false accusations of adultery, incest, and treason. This involved forcing her own musician, Mark Smeaton, to confess under agonizing torture to having an affair with her, a confession almost certainly extracted under duress. But here's the truly sick, unimaginable part. Henry, the ultimate puppet master, reportedly made Anne Boleyn watch from her prison window in the Tower of London, as 5 men, including her own beloved brother, George Boleyn, were executed for allegedly sleeping with her. Imagine her agony. She had to stand there, helpless, knowing she was next, forced to witness innocent people die agonizing deaths, all because of her husband's escalating paranoia and desperate need to be rid of her. It was a spectacle designed to crush her spirit before her body. Then there was Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife, who got it even worse in some respects. She was barely out of her teens, essentially a teenager, when Henry, a morbidly obese and ailing man, married her. When he discovered her past innocent relationships, a fury of possessiveness consumed him. He didn't just execute her, he went further, making it a legal precedent. He personally pushed through Parliament a monstrous law, the Act of Attainder, making it treason for anyone to marry the king or queen without first revealing their complete sexual history. Imagine being so petty, so consumed by your own insecurity and rage, that you changed the entire legal system of England because your teenage wife wasn't a virgin upon marriage to you. It was a direct, humiliating public indictment of her, designed to retroactively justify his tyrannical actions. But beyond the executions and legal maneuverings, the psychological games Henry played were arguably the most insidious form of torture. He was a master of emotional manipulation. He would shower his wives with extravagant gifts, effusive affection, and promises of eternal devotion one day, only to completely ignore them, subject them to chilling silences, or openly threaten their lives and their family's safety the next. This constant, unpredictable cycle of love bombing and terror kept them in a perpetual state of fear and emotional instability. Consider Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. After years of marriage, she spent her final, heartbreaking years essentially under house arrest, cruelly separated from her beloved daughter Mary, who she was forbidden from seeing. All the while, Henry viciously spread rumors that she was mentally ill and deranged, attempting to discredit her in the eyes of his court and the world. She died alone, isolated in Kimbolton Castle, possibly poisoned by those eager to please the king, writing desperate, heartfelt letters to Henry that he never even bothered to read. The man treated human beings like disposable objects, pawns in his grand, self-serving game for a male heir and absolute power. Here's something that will truly blow your mind. Henry actually forced his wives to sign documents agreeing to their own divorces or annulments. Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, was so utterly terrified of him, witnessing the fates of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, that she readily agreed to a fake marriage annulment, fabricating reasons for its invalidity just to avoid execution. She basically had to pretend their marriage never even happened, and then, in a final twisted indignity, she had to publicly thank him for the privilege of not being murdered. And Jane Seymour, often painted as the lucky one because she died of natural causes. She died from complications after giving birth to Henry's longed-for son, Edward VI, but her death didn't bring solemn mourning from the king. Henry was already eyeing up his next wife, Anne of Cleves, before Jane's body was even cold. He waited a chilling exact 9 days after her funeral to start actively planning his next marriage. The man's profound lack of empathy, his perception of women as mere vessels for his dynastic ambitions, is truly sickening. And the worst part is that these women, trapped in a patriarchal society, had absolutely no escape. Divorce wasn't an option for them. Running away meant certain death and public dishonor, and fighting back meant not just your own brutal execution, but potentially the complete destruction of your entire family and lineage. Their lives were a terrifying gamble at the hands of a volatile king. His eating habits were absolutely insane. If you think modern competitive eating contests are crazy today, wait until you hear about the sheer mind-boggling scale of Henry VIII's daily food consumption. This man didn't just eat like a king, he ate like he was actively trying to single-handedly cause a famine across his entire kingdom. Modern estimates, based on detailed court records, suggest Henry consumed roughly 5,000 calories per day, an absolutely enormous amount for anyone. For context, that's more than double, sometimes triple, what an active adult male should consume, even one engaging in rigorous physical activity. And remember, this guy could barely walk by the end of his life. His diet was a grotesque monument to his unchecked gluttony, and a significant contributor to his enormous weight and failing health. But the sheer quantity of food wasn't even the weirdest, most fascinating part. It was what he ate and how he ate it that reveals the depths of his eccentricities and paranoia. A typical meal for Henry wasn't just a few courses. It was a lavish, over-the-top feast that could include an entire roasted pig, multiple whole chickens, several types of exotic and local fish, mountains of heavy, rich bread, and enough wine to metaphorically float a small boat. His royal kitchen staff, a staggering army of culinary professionals, prepared over 800 different dishes every single day just for his household, with Henry personally sampling dozens of them at each meal. The royal kitchens, a sprawling complex, employed over 200 people working around the clock: butchers, bakers, brewers, cooks, scullery maids, all dedicated solely to keeping up with his insatiable appetite and the demands of royal feasts. But here's where it gets truly bizarre, dipping into the realm of medieval superstition and royal ego. Henry was convinced that certain foods had magical, almost alchemical properties that would enhance his royal attributes. He genuinely believed that eating swan would make him more graceful and majestic, befitting a king. Consuming massive amounts of venison and other wild game, particularly deer, he thought would make him a better, more formidable hunter. And most comically, he was convinced that gargantuan quantities of oysters would enhance his performance with his wives, particularly for producing a male heir. So he'd gorge himself on these specific power foods in truly massive quantities, almost like some kind of medieval superfood obsession, believing they were essential to his royal vigor, despite all evidence to the contrary from his rotting health. The man also had the strangest, most theatrical eating rituals, born out of his overwhelming paranoia. Every single morsel of food that was destined to enter Henry's royal mouth was first tasted by multiple servants, acting as dedicated food tasters, meticulously checking for poison. This was a common practice among monarchs, but Henry took it to an extreme. Get this, he was so profoundly paranoid that he required his food tasters to wait a full 30 minutes after consuming a portion of his meal before he would even touch anything himself. This was to ensure they didn't suddenly drop dead from some kind of slow-acting poison. Henry's meals were, therefore, not just meals. They were elaborate, drawn-out theatrical performances. He'd eat in front of hundreds of courtiers, silent witnesses to this ritual, and the entire process could take up to 4 hours. Imagine sitting there, respectfully, watching this massive, increasingly immobile, and rotting king slowly work his way through enough food to feed a small village, all while pretending this was perfectly normal, even majestic, royal behavior. You don't typically learn this in history classes, but Henry actually banned certain foods from his court, not because they were unhealthy or scarce, but because he thought they were utterly beneath his royal status. Common people's food, like humble turnips, simple barley, or even plain vegetables, were literally illegal at his table. This was despite the fact that a more balanced diet, including such simple fare, probably would have been infinitely better for his health than the mountains of rich fatty meat and sugar he consumed daily. The truly insane part is that even as his body was literally falling apart from the consequences of his diet, even as the ulcers on his legs became an open testament to his internal decay, Henry compulsively kept eating more and more, convinced in his delusional royal mind that his divine status somehow made him immune to the mundane consequences of his gluttony. The paranoia that ruled an empire. Henry VIII's paranoia wasn't just your typical trust-no-one attitude, a mere side effect of power. This man cultivated and enforced a chilling atmosphere of fear that turned his entire kingdom into a vast, intricate surveillance state, a system that would make even modern dictators green with envy. By his final desperate years, Henry was so profoundly convinced that everyone, from his closest advisors to his own family members, was plotting against him, that he systematically transformed royal life into a living, waking nightmare for everyone around him. The air at court was thick with suspicion, every conversation a potential trap, every gesture scrutinized. Let's start with his private, innermost sanctum, his sleeping arrangements. The king, ostensibly the most secure man in England, slept with loaded crossbows readily accessible next to his bed and kept multiple sharp daggers secreted under his pillow. But even these personal defenses weren't enough to quell the demons of his mind. He further demanded that heavily armed guards be stationed inside his very bedroom, watching him sleep through the entire night, their silent vigil a constant reminder of his deep-seated fear. Imagine the chilling reality, being so utterly terrified of assassination, of a dagger in the dark, that you couldn't even close your eyes without witnesses, knowing armed men were observing your most vulnerable state. Sleep offered no true escape from his terror. The royal palaces themselves, once grand symbols of power and artistry, became fortresses of paranoia. Henry, consumed by his fears, ordered the clandestine construction of numerous secret passages, hidden stairwells, and concealed compartments throughout every building he resided in. These weren't for romantic trysts or convenient shortcuts. They were meticulously designed escape routes, so he could flee if assassins managed to breach his formidable defenses. Furthermore, his obsession with surveillance extended to installing concealed peepholes in walls, allowing him to spy on his own unsuspecting courtiers. Hidden listening devices, ingeniously placed behind tapestries or within intricate carvings, were installed in meeting rooms, enabling him to eavesdrop on supposedly private conversations, turning casual remarks into potential treasonous whispers. But here's where it gets truly insane, spiraling into a Kafkaesque nightmare of suspicion. Henry created an entire multi-layered network of spies, whose primary job was to spy on his other spies. He had informants watching his informants, who were in turn watching more informants, creating this twisted, self-devouring web of surveillance, where absolutely nobody knew who they could truly trust. Court life became a psychological horror show, a constant tightrope walk, where saying the wrong thing, or even an innocent facial expression interpreted incorrectly by the wrong person, could literally get you executed for treason. The fear of false accusation was as potent as the fear of genuine conspiracy. His food paranoia, already touched upon, reached absolutely ridiculous, almost theatrical levels. Not only did he have multiple food tasters for every dish, but he required his meals to be prepared in completely sealed kitchens, veritable fortresses within the palace, with armed guards meticulously watching every single step of the cooking process. The salt, the spices, even the water used in his meals. Everything had to be tested by different trusted individuals, forming a complex chain of command designed to prevent his poisoning. He was so utterly convinced that someone somewhere would attempt to poison him that the simple act of eating a meal became a meticulously planned military operation, a daily battle against an unseen enemy. The man's suspicion even extended to his own blood. He notoriously suspected his own children of plotting against him. He had spies placed to watch Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own daughters, even when they were young and powerless, because he was consumed by the delusional belief that they were actively planning to overthrow him. These were mere children, vulnerable and dependent, and he treated them like hardened enemy agents in their own home, eroding any familial trust or affection. Henry's paranoia got so extreme that it transcended reality. He started executing people for crimes they hadn't even committed yet, or crimes that existed only in his fevered imagination. He'd order someone killed because he allegedly dreamed they had betrayed him, or because a sycophantic courtier, eager to gain favor, suggested they might be disloyal in the future. The infamous Tower of London was constantly full of people whose only discernible crime was simply existing near Henry while he was in one of his increasingly frequent, terrifyingly paranoid moods. The truly terrifying part, the contagion of fear, is that Henry's paranoia was so potent, so pervasive, that it infected his entire court. Nobles started spying on each other, turning friend against friend, family member against family member. Servants, desperate for survival or imaginary rewards, betrayed their masters based on flimsy suspicions, and everyone lived in constant palpable fear that they'd be the next arbitrary victim of the king's increasingly delusional and murderous suspicions. Death couldn't even stop the chaos. You'd think Henry VIII's tyrannical reign of terror, his endless cruelty and self-inflicted misery, would finally end with his death, bringing a semblance of peace to those around him. Right? Wrong. This man was so utterly committed to being a complete disaster, a force of unprecedented mayhem, that even his decaying corpse managed to cause absolute stomach-churning chaos. His very passing was a final grotesque act in his lifelong drama. Let's start with his agonizing final weeks. Henry, having ballooned to an unimaginable size and crippled by his festering leg wounds, was so massive that he literally couldn't walk on his own. His strained servants had the Sisyphean task of carrying him everywhere, employing a specially designed, reinforced chair with an intricate system of pulleys and wheels. But here's the truly disgusting, unforgettable detail. His chronic leg wounds had become so profoundly infected, so utterly gangrenous, that pieces of rotting, putrefying flesh would literally fall off his body as his attendants laboriously moved him from room to room. Servants, often gagging, had the grim duty of following behind him with cloths and buckets to clean up the chunks of decomposing king that dropped onto the palace's grand floors, leaving a trail of decay in his wake. His actual death scene, on January 28, 1547, was like something ripped straight from a horror movie. Henry's body had swollen to such grotesque, unnatural proportions that his skin was stretched taut and shiny, almost bursting. The stench of his decay was so overwhelming, so viscerally repulsive, that even his hardened doctors, who were intimately familiar with the brutal realities and putrid horrors of medieval medical practices, had to periodically leave the room to vomit, unable to bear the reek. When he finally drew his last rasping breath, such was the fear and revulsion he inspired, that nobody wanted to get close enough to officially confirm he was truly, irrevocably dead. They kept their distance, waiting, almost hoping, for his torment to finally cease. But wait, it gets so much worse, reaching levels of the absurdly macabre. Henry's body, already enormous, became so bloated with the gases of internal decomposition, the natural, but in his case amplified, processes of putrefaction, that his specially constructed coffin had to be additionally reinforced. They had wrapped his massive corpse in layers of heavy lead sheets and meticulously sealed it within multiple robust wooden boxes, thinking, foolishly, that this elaborate containment would finally manage the inevitable, horrifying mess. They were spectacularly, utterly wrong. During the lengthy funeral procession, a solemn, dignified journey from London to his final resting place at Windsor Castle, something absolutely unbelievably grotesque happened. The coffin, despite all its reinforcements, literally exploded. The immense pressure generated by the gases from Henry's rapidly decomposing body built up to such an unbearable degree that the lead lining burst open and rotting royal remains, liquefied and gaseous, splattered violently all over the inside of the hearse, seeping out onto the road. The accompanying smell was so horrific, so profoundly nauseating, that the entire funeral procession, a meticulously planned royal spectacle, had to come to a grinding halt, while frantic servants, gagging and retching, cleaned up the putrid mess with buckets and rags. It was an utter public indignity. Here's a detail that will haunt your dreams and firmly cement the ignominy of his end. As the procession moved on, leaving behind the gruesome scene, hungry, scavenging dogs were reportedly seen licking up the actual, decomposing remains of Henry VIII that had leaked from his shattered coffin onto the muddy country road. The man who had proclaimed himself to rule by divine right, who wielded absolute power, executed his wives, and terrorized his court, ended up as literal dog food on a common highway, a final, brutal irony for a life lived with such unbridled arrogance. Even his burial became a disaster. They had to dig his grave extra wide to accommodate the massive coffin and its lead-encased contents. But the ground beneath the chapel kept collapsing under the immense weight. The soil simply couldn't support the sheer tonnage of all that lead and rotting flesh, leading to multiple frustrating attempts just to get the king's remains into the ground and keep them there, a final act of rebellion from the very earth itself. The chaos, however, didn't end with his burial. For years afterward, strange noises and terrible smells were reportedly heard and detected coming from Henry's tomb. Some superstitious souls claimed it was his restless ghost, unable to find peace even in death. More grounded historians, however, suggest it was probably just more gases continuously escaping from his still, slowly, horrifically decomposing remains, a lingering, putrid reminder of the tyrant beneath the chapel floor. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Henry's death and the gruesome handling of his body was so traumatic for everyone involved that several of the servants who were forced to handle his decaying corpse reportedly died within weeks of his funeral, possibly from infections they caught from direct contact with his rotting flesh. Their lives too were consumed by the king's terrifying end. So there you have it, the real Henry VIII. Not the charismatic, idealized king of popular culture, but a walking, talking disaster whose own body spectacularly betrayed him, just as dramatically as he betrayed everyone and everything around him. A man so utterly consumed by uncontrollable paranoia, insatiable gluttony, and a monstrous ego that he systematically turned one of Europe's most powerful and vibrant kingdoms into his personal horror show. The most powerful man in England became, in his final years, a pathetic, immobile prisoner of his own decaying body, and even death itself, the ultimate end, couldn't quell his capacity for causing absolute, visceral chaos. His enduring legacy isn't just the Church of England or the tragic fates of his 6 wives. It's a chilling, unforgettable masterclass in how absolute, unchecked power can utterly corrupt a human being, transforming them into something genuinely monstrous. If these disturbing, bizarre, and horrifying royal facts made you question everything you thought you knew about history, maybe hit that subscribe button, because there are plenty more gruesome, untold truths that textbooks conveniently leave out. And trust me, you haven't heard anything yet.